A veteran scarred by war walked along a quiet creek, haunted by memories he could never silence. But that morning, he froze in his tracks. Tied to a tree with rusty wire was an old German shepherd, trembling, his fur matted, his eyes carrying the same loneliness Ethan felt inside. Round the dog's neck was a collar, and on it a note scribbled in faded ink. "His name is Whiskey. He's too old. I can't keep him. Please forgive me." In that instant, two broken souls. One man, one dog crossed paths in a way that would change them both forever. What happened next will bring tears to your eyes and remind you that miracles often arrive in the most unexpected forms. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe every animal deserves love, not abandonment, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. Red Willow, Montana woke to a cold breath of wind rustling through its tall pines. The early light filtered weakly through gray clouds, giving the forest an almost dreamlike silver hue. It was late October, and the town was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes everything sound louder than it is. The creek behind the eastern ridge flowed steady, its water black with the morning chill, carving through the frost-covered earth like a whisper. Ethan Cole moved through the brush with a practiced gait. He wore a thick canvas jacket, faded at the elbows, over a red plaid shirt. His jeans were worn, tucked into muddy boots that told of a man who spent more time outside than in. 43 years old, with broad shoulders, a square jaw beneath a short-cropped beard, and eyes too tired for their age, Ethan was the kind of man you'd notice only because he moved like he didn't want to be seen. He had returned from Iraq over a decade ago, but the war hadn't let go. Its presence lived in the way he kept his back to walls and flinched at distant echoes. PTSD was a word the doctors used. To Ethan, it was a shadow that followed him from sunrise to sundown and often beyond. The cabin he called home stood near the forest's edge, a squat wooden structure, built by his grandfather, then fortified by his father. Since returning from overseas, Ethan had lived there in solitude. No visitors, no pets, just silence. And yet, this morning, after another night broken by the same dream smoke, blood, Danny calling out, he'd been pulled to walk. It wasn't the first time he'd sought comfort in the creekside path. Something about the movement, the crunch of leaves, the sharp bite of cold air helped still the noise in his head. The water reminded him that time moved on, even if parts of him didn't. He rounded a bend near an old pine stump and paused. A shape, dark and slumped, sat motionless near the base of a tree. From a distance, it looked like a discarded bag or maybe a twisted piece of tarp tangled in roots. But then it shifted. Ethan squinted and stepped closer. His breath hitched. It was a dog. The animal's body was pressed against the trunk of the tree as if trying to disappear into it. Gray and black fur clung to it in patches, dirty and matted. The creature was large, at least 80 pounds, Ethan guessed, but frail. Its ribs showed through the coat, and its legs folded unnaturally beneath it, strained as if it had long since given up on comfort. Thick wire bound the dog's torso and neck to the tree, loops twisted so tight the flesh puckered beneath them. The positioning wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Whoever had left the dog here hadn't meant for it to get away. Ethan felt the cold deepen inside his chest. He took a step forward. The dog's eyes lifted. They were cloudy-age, maybe illness, but sharp beneath the film. Brown, with a flicker of gold. Old eyes, but aware. They locked with his. And in that gaze, Ethan didn't see fear. He saw resignation, not the kind that begged for help, the kind that no longer expected it. A breeze stirred, lifting a crumpled scrap of paper from the dog's collar. It flapped once, then settled. The collar was old, leather cracked and weather-stained. The paper was taped on with clear plastic improvised, hurried, but not careless. Words, ink smudged from dew, were still visible. His name is Whiskey. He's too old. I can't keep him. Please forgive me. Ethan stared. The world tilted for a moment. His throat tightened. It was all too familiar. The way the dog had been tied. The paper left behind like an apology no one would read. The silence. His vision blurred. Not from tears, he hadn't cried in years, but from something rising in him. Not rage, not grief. Recognition. This dog had been left in a way that Ethan understood. Discarded. Silenced. A burden someone chose to unload. Whiskey, they called him. Ethan didn't know if that had been his name for years, or if it had only come into existence on that note, but it didn't matter. He looked at the dog's face again, those eyes still fixed on him, and everything else fell away. Gone was the creek. Gone were the trees and the frost. All that remained was Ethan, and this broken creature looking up at him like it had already accepted the end. Ethan knelt slowly, his knees pressing into the frozen earth, the chill bleeding through his jeans but barely registering. The old German shepherd hadn't moved an inch. The wire that bound him was grotesquely tight dug so deep into the fur and flesh that Ethan's stomach turned. It wasn't just around the neck. The loops wound around the ribs, under the belly, across the front legs. Whoever had done this hadn't simply restrained the animal they'd ensured he couldn't even shift to ease his pain. The dog's eyes remained fixed on Ethan dull with age and fatigue, but unwavering. There was no flinch, no growl, no cry. Only a quiet, unbearable patience, as if Whiskey was waiting to see what kind of man Ethan would be. Ethan drew the knife from the sheath clipped inside his jacket. It was an old, sand-worn military utility blade. The handle was cracked in places, smoothed by years of sweat and grit. He had once carved his initials into the hilt in a hot tent under desert moonlight, bored and restless. Danny had teased him about it for weeks after. Like, someone's gonna steal your knife, Staff Sergeant? Ethan swallowed against the lump rising in his throat. He examined the wire. It was rusted and thin in some places, but twisted tight, biting in where the shepherd's skin was most delicate. His hand hovered above the dog's flank before he made contact. Whiskey gave no reaction to the touch, not even a shiver. His fur was matted and cold, the flesh beneath thin and trembling. Ethan muttered, more to himself than the dog, "All right, buddy, let's get this off you." He slipped the blade carefully under the first loop. It snagged against fur, then bit into metal. The sound it made was soft but violent steel against rust, scraping like nails on bone. Ethan grimaced and adjusted his grip. His hands weren't as steady as they once were. The wire didn't give easily. It had been cinched down with effort. The person who had left Whiskey here hadn't acted in panic. No, this had taken time. As the blade sawed through the first twist, a faint echo rippled through Ethan's mind. A pop, distant but deafening. The desert, the smell of cordite. Danny's face slack under red dust. His hand jerked involuntarily and the knife slipped. He steadied himself, forcing the memory back down. The dog didn't even flinch. "Still with me?" Ethan murmured. Whiskey blinked once. Slow, intentional. The second wire gave way more easily. As it fell, Ethan saw where the skin beneath was raw and bloodied. He cursed under his breath and reached into his coat pocket for the small handkerchief he kept tucked away. It was old, a gift from his sister years ago, embroidered with a faded American flag in one corner. He pressed it gently against the wound, then continued cutting. With each loop released, the dog seemed to exhale more deeply, as if air was returning to places it hadn't reached in hours. When Ethan reached the last knot buried just behind the front leg, his hand was slick with sweat despite the cold. The wire twisted tighter here, as though it had been cinched with a final act of cruelty. He slipped the blade in slowly. His breath caught. A sound came, not from the dog, but from Ethan himself. A whisper of grief that escaped before he could stop it. He thought of all the men he couldn't save, and now, this simple, old dog tied to a tree like garbage. His voice broke as he spoke, barely audible. "I'm sorry." The wire snapped. Whiskey sagged forward at once. His legs gave way completely, and his body folded onto the frozen ground in a tired heap. Ethan caught him gently, lowering the weight with both arms, surprised by how light the shepherd was. Too light. Whiskey let out a sound. Not a bark, not a whimper. A soft exhale, like someone finally putting down a heavy load. Ethan sat down beside him. The cold from the ground bled through his jeans, but he didn't move. He reached down and placed a hand over the dog's shoulder, feeling the shallow rise and fall of breath. Then, unexpectedly, Whiskey shifted. He turned his head slightly and rested it on Ethan's thigh. It was the smallest gesture, but for Ethan, it unraveled something inside. He sat there, fingers still resting against the coarse fur, and felt something that had been absent for years: connection. No words, no expectations, just presence. He looked around the clearing. Snow was beginning to drift down again, the flakes thicker now, catching in Whiskey's fur. The air was growing sharper, the kind of cold that whispered warning. They couldn't stay much longer, but for the moment, Ethan let time stretch. A crow called in the distance. The creek continued its quiet gurgle. Whiskey breathed. Ethan breathed. That was enough. Eventually, he spoke again. "Whiskey, huh?" he said quietly, looking down at the dog's collar. "That's a hell of a name." The dog didn't react, but his tail shifted slightly, brushing against the dirt in a slow drag. "I knew a guy once, Danny. Thought whiskey was the cure for everything. Broken bones, heartbreak, bad luck." He paused. Turns out it wasn't, but he believed it right up to the end. Whiskey's tail moved again, just once. Ethan smiled faintly. He stayed there another few minutes, watching the snow start to gather in small patches around them. Then he looked down at the old dog leaning against him and nodded once. "All right, Whiskey, let's get out of here." By the time Ethan reached the clearing behind his cabin, the snow had grown heavier, settling in soft layers on Whiskey's fur and across Ethan's shoulders. The dog had barely moved since being lifted from the forest floor. He hung limp in Ethan's arms, his breathing shallow but steady. It had been a long walk, half a mile uphill through snow-dusted underbrush, but Ethan didn't stop once. Not because he wasn't tired, but because stopping meant the cold might win. His cabin stood like a tired sentinel at the edge of the woods, a squat structure of aged timber and green tin roofing, one side shielded by stacked firewood, the other bearing an American flag faded nearly white. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney. Ethan had left the fire burning low before leaving that morning habit, not foresight. He was glad for it now. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped inside. The warmth was weak, but it greeted him like a memory. The room was plain. A wood-burning stove, a worn recliner with army green upholstery, a bookshelf half filled with paperbacks and dust, and a cot tucked under the window. The walls bore no photos. The past lived in Ethan's head, not on display. He set Whiskey down gently on the braided rug near the stove. The dog shifted, adjusting his position with a low grunt, but made no effort to stand. Ethan knelt beside him, running a hand along the side of his ribs. He could feel every bone. "Hang in there, buddy," he said under his breath, standing to fetch a bowl from the kitchenette. The water from the tap was cold but clean. He filled the ceramic bowl halfway and set it down beside Whiskey, who sniffed at it with hesitation before taking a slow, careful drink. Ethan watched as the dog drank in silence, his tongue barely making a sound. When he finished, he rested his head back down on the floor, close to Ethan's boot. Ethan stood there for a moment, hands on hips, unsure of what came next. His original plan had been simple: bring the dog back, let him rest for a few hours, and then call the local animal rescue service in Missoula. He didn't even have their number written down. It was somewhere in an old phone book under the sink, pages warped with moisture. But as he looked down at Whiskey, curled beside the stove like he belonged there, Ethan didn't move to make the call. He grabbed a blanket from the cot and draped it gently over the dog. Then, reaching into the small cabinet beneath the sink, he pulled out a can of beans, his go-to emergency meal, and heated them over the stove. Whiskey lifted his head slightly at the smell, but made no effort to move. Ethan set a small spoonful aside to cool before offering it. Whiskey sniffed, then licked it once before settling back down. "Didn't think so," Ethan said softly. "We'll try again later." Outside, the wind picked up. Snow pressed against the windows in thin, ghostly sheets. Ethan stirred the beans absently, staring into the small, flickering flame. The silence in the cabin was different now, not empty, but shared. After dinner, he unrolled an old sleeping bag and placed it beside the stove. Whiskey didn't resist when Ethan gently guided him onto it. He curled into the warmth, releasing a deep, ragged sigh. Ethan sat in the recliner, staring at the fire. He hadn't meant to get attached, hadn't meant to feel anything at all, but the room, for the first time in years, didn't feel like it belonged to a man waiting out his own life. It felt like someone might be living there again. Later that night, just past midnight, Ethan woke gasping. The dream had come again. Gunfire. The screams, the sand turning red beneath his boots. Danny's voice shouting his name. He sat up, sweat slicked down his chest despite the cold, eyes wide, lungs heaving. For a long moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the smell of wood smoke grounded him. And then a pressure. Something soft and warm touched his hand. Whiskey. The old dog had crossed the cabin in silence and now sat beside the cot, one paw resting gently on Ethan's fingers. His eyes were half-lidded, tail still, but present, watching, waiting. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't move his hand away. His pulse slowed. He lay back down, and Whiskey lay beside him, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his breath against the cot. In the darkness, the nightmares didn't return. And for the first time and longer than he could remember, Ethan fell asleep with something beside him that didn't vanish by morning. The morning sun filtered weakly through the pine trees outside Ethan's cabin, casting soft gold across the floorboards. The fire had long died down, leaving only a faint warmth in the air. Ethan sat at the small wooden table by the window, the tattered collar in one hand, the damp scrap of paper in the other. He had read it so many times now that the words were etched into his mind. 6 simple sentences that had managed to carve something raw open inside him. His name is Whiskey. He's too old. I can't keep him. Please forgive me. The paper smelled of rain, earth, and something sour like guilt. Ethan turned it over again, as if another sentence might appear, but there was nothing, just those words, written in quick, uneven handwriting. There wasn't even a name. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood ceiling. The image of Whiskey, tied and trembling at the creek's edge, flickered through his mind like a war flashback. His jaw tightened. Whoever had done it hadn't even bothered to leave food. Just a rope. Just abandonment. Whiskey stirred near the stove, still curled in the same sleeping bag Ethan had laid out for him the night before. His ears twitched, his tail gave a small thump, and he blinked up at Ethan with clouded but loyal eyes. Ethan sighed and stood, tucking the paper into the inside pocket of his flannel coat. "Come on, old man. Let's get you looked at." The Missoula Veterinary Clinic sat in a red brick building at the corner of East Spruce Street, nestled between a bakery and a bicycle repair shop. It had one of those old-fashioned hand-painted signs, Dr. Maeve Lattimore, DVM, Compassionate Care for All Creatures. A cat-shaped wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze above the door. Ethan pushed through the entrance with Whiskey limping beside him on a makeshift leash. The air inside was warm, smelling faintly of antiseptic, fur, and peanut butter dog treats. Behind the front desk sat a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair tied up in a messy bun. Her name tag read Maeve. She glanced up from her paperwork and smiled. Not the stiff, polite kind Ethan had grown used to, but one that reached her eyes. "Good morning. This your boy?" Ethan gave a short nod. "Found him yesterday. Thought he should be seen." Maeve stood, her long frame unfolding from the chair with grace. She was tall and willowy, dressed in navy scrubs and faded Converse sneakers. Her face was lined but kind, with gentle eyes that missed nothing. "Well, he's lucky you did." Whiskey hesitated at the exam room door, but Ethan crouched beside him and whispered something under his breath. Whether it was the tone or the words didn't matter. Whiskey followed. Inside, Maeve guided Whiskey onto the table with careful hands. "German Shepherd. About 12 years old, I'd say. You see this graying around the muzzle and eyes? That's age. But these scars on his hindquarters, those aren't." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. Maeve continued, her voice softening. "Looks like he's had a rough life. Probably used for labor or guarding property. See the stiffness in his joints? Arthritis, most likely. The way he favors his right paw suggests past injury." Whiskey sat quietly, panting softly as Maeve examined him. His tail gave the occasional flick, but he didn't growl or flinch. "His heart's strong. He's underweight, but that's fixable. You did right bringing him in." She glanced at Ethan. "Is he yours now?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at Whiskey, who was watching him again with those same waiting eyes. "I guess he is." Before Maeve could respond, the door opened and a small boy entered, led by a woman in a parka. The boy couldn't have been older than 6. He held a calico cat in a carrier and wore thick glasses that magnified his already wide eyes. "Benji, sit here," the woman said, guiding him to a bench near the wall. Whiskey turned his head at the sound. His ears perked slightly. As the boy sat down, he looked over at the dog, curious. Without being prompted, Whiskey slowly padded across the room, joints cracking faintly. He stopped beside Benji, who blinked at him in surprise. Then, slowly, Whiskey extended his neck and gently licked the boy's hand. Benji giggled, a bright, clear sound, and reached out to stroke Whiskey's ears. The woman stiffened. "Benji." "It's okay," Ethan said. "He's gentle." Whiskey leaned into the touch, tail wagging faintly. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a tightness easing, like a muscle unclenching for the first time in years. Maeve noticed. "Looks like your boy still has some light left in him." Ethan nodded, lips twitching in what might have been his first genuine smile in years. He looked down at Whiskey. "So do I." The Montana night curled around the cabin like a heavy wool blanket quiet, windless, too still. In the thick silence, the ticking of the old clock on the mantel sounded like hammer strikes, counting down to something Ethan couldn't see but felt creeping beneath his skin. He tossed and turned under the patchwork quilt, drenched in sweat, though the air outside was near freezing. Then the world exploded, or it did in his mind. The boom came first, a deep, gut-shaking thunder that ripped the sky apart. The orange glow that followed filled his vision with fire and loss. Ethan shot upright in bed, gasping like he'd surfaced from drowning. His chest heaved, his fingers trembled, and before he even understood where he was already moving blind, frantic. He crashed into the bedroom door, slamming it open, stumbling through the hallway in boxers and a threadbare t-shirt. The wood floor creaked beneath his feet, loud and foreign. He didn't recognize his own house. His lips moved, but no words came, only sounds. Muffled, broken cries of a man still trapped in another place. Then he heard a soft whine. Whiskey. The dog emerged from the shadows of the living room, his old body sluggish but steady. His fur caught the moonlight patches of silver and worn gray, his ribs still faintly visible beneath the matted coat. He didn't bark or panic. Instead, he walked forward and placed himself directly in Ethan's path, like a rock anchoring a river. Ethan froze. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the animal. Whiskey let out a low, comforting whimper and leaned in, resting his scarred head against Ethan's chest. For a moment, everything stilled. The fire in Ethan's mind dimmed. The desert wind, the shouting, the smoke, they evaporated, leaving only this warm weight against his ribs and the quiet sound of an old dog breathing. He collapsed to the floor. Arms wrapped around Whiskey's neck, Ethan let the grief spill loose. Deep sobs racked his body, the kind he hadn't allowed himself in years. Not when his friend died in that ambush near the Tigris. Not when he came back and found the world too loud, too clean, too hollow. Not even when his wife left without a word, her side of the bed colder every day. But here, with this broken dog refusing to leave him alone, he cried like a man who had nothing left to hide. The next morning arrived gently. Pale sunshine filtered through the pines outside and fell in slanted beams across the porch. Ethan sat on the front steps, coffee in one hand, whiskey lying beside him with his chin resting on Ethan's boot. They sat in silence, watching the forest breathe. Ethan's eyes were red, his shoulders slouched, but there was a stillness to his face that hadn't been there before, like a storm had passed, even if the clouds still lingered. That was when the neighbor appeared. Helen Brooks was a woman in her late 70s, small-framed and sharp-eyed. She wore a wool cardigan the color of rust and a faded apron dotted with flour. Her silver hair was tied into a neat bun, and her boots crunched softly on the frost-covered grass. She lived in the next cabin, down the dirt road, about a 10-minute walk, and was known in the neighborhood for her cinnamon rolls, her fiercely tended garden, and her sharp tongue if you disrespected wildlife. She held a small tin wrapped in a checkered kitchen towel. "Thought I'd bring by some breakfast," she said, without waiting for an invitation. Her voice carried the confidence of someone used to being needed, even when she wasn't. Ethan stood a little awkwardly. "That's kind of you." She glanced at Whiskey, who raised his head slightly but didn't bark. He looked at her with the calm resignation of someone who'd seen all the bad there was to see and had no time left for suspicion. "Well now," Helen murmured, crouching slowly, careful on her knees. "Aren't you a handsome gentleman?" She let him sniff her hand, then gently stroked his muzzle. "You've got a quiet dignity about you, don't you?" Whiskey licked her fingers once, a soft acknowledgement. Helen looked up at Ethan. "Is he yours?" Ethan hesitated. "Not sure yet." "Well," she said, rising with a slight grunt, "he thinks you are, and that's half the battle." She handed him the tin. "You both look like you could use something warm." He accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you." Helen studied the two of them for a moment, man and dog, both scarred, both silent. Then she smiled, not with pity, but something gentler. "Maybe you both saved each other," she said, and turned to leave. Ethan watched her go, then looked down at Whiskey. The dog had returned to resting his chin on Ethan's boot, eyes closed, tail giving a slow, lazy wag. "Maybe she's right," Ethan muttered. And for the first time the words didn't feel like a lie. The morning air carried a bitter chill, even as sunlight shimmered across the frost-covered pine needles like powdered sugar on glass. Thin wisps of mist hovered above the creek, twisting like ghostly ribbons between the branches. Ethan zipped up his weathered brown jacket and glanced down at Whiskey, who stood beside him with quiet anticipation. It had been nearly a week since that night, the night when Whiskey stood guard during his nightmare, the night when the old soldier had finally broken open. Since then, something had shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Ethan to consider returning to the place where it all began. "We're going back," he said softly. Whiskey, now more steady on his feet thanks to rest and proper food, tilted his head slightly. His ears, worn but alert, twitched as he sniffed the air. The scars along his ribs were still visible, but the bruising had faded. He moved with the gait of an aging sentinel, slow, deliberate, but with a pride no hardship could erase. They followed the narrow footpath behind the cabin, weaving through the same stretch of pine woods that had once felt more like a trap than a refuge. Ethan's boots crunched against the frozen underbrush. Whiskey walked beside him, his breath fogging gently with every exhale. The creek soon came into view, winding through the trees like a silver vein. The same spot. The same crooked tree with its twisted trunk leaning toward the water like an old man whispering to the stream. And the memories hit Ethan like cold wind. The image of Whiskey tied there, motionless. The ragged note, the look in the dog's eyes that had pierced straight through him. Whiskey stopped a few feet from the tree. His body tensed for a moment, muscles tightening under his coat. Then slowly, he took a step closer to the edge of the bank. His nails scraped softly against the rocks. He sniffed the air, then turned and sat, not facing the tree, but the water, as if choosing to see what was ahead rather than what had been. Ethan swallowed the tightness in his throat. He pulled the note from his coat pocket, the same tattered slip of paper once stuffed beneath the dog's collar. Its edges were crumpled, still faintly stained with water and time. He had read it more times than he could count, turning it over in his mind on sleepless nights. His name is Whiskey. He's too old. I can't keep him. Please forgive me. Forgiveness. It was easier to give to a dog than a person, but still, something in Ethan knew this chapter needed closing, for Whiskey and for himself. He pulled out a small glass jar, one he'd taken from the kitchen, cleaned and dried. Gently, he folded the note and slipped it inside, then screwed the lid shut. With his bare hands, he began to dig beneath the roots of the crooked tree. The earth was stiff with frost, but it gave way. Once the hole was deep enough, he placed the jar inside and covered it back up. No ceremony, no speech, just a quiet moment, the creek bubbling beside them. Then he pulled a pocket knife from his coat, the same one he'd used to cut Whiskey free, and carved into the bark of the leaning tree. Whiskey is home now. A sound broke the silence. Laughter, young voices drifting through the trees. Ethan looked up to see a group of teenagers walking along the far side of the creek. 4 of them, 3 boys and a girl, all around 15 or 16, bundled in puffer jackets and beanies, their breath puffing in clouds as they kicked at the snow and joked loudly. "Whoa, cool dog," one of them called, pointing at Whiskey. The girl, tall and freckled with a knitted purple scarf and curious eyes, approached the creek's edge cautiously. "Can we pet him?" Ethan glanced at Whiskey. The old dog stood, stretched slightly, and then made his way across the narrow wooden bridge that spanned the creek. He moved slowly, his legs stiff, but with purpose. When he reached them, he simply sat, allowing one boy to scratch behind his ears, another to gently pat his back. The girl knelt and whispered something softly, and Whiskey leaned into her hand, eyes half-lidded in calm. No growl, no fear, just patience. Ethan watched in quiet wonder. It occurred to him then, not for the first time, how easily Whiskey could have been dangerous, defensive. And yet here he was, letting himself be touched, surrounded by strangers, tail wagging faintly. Trusting, forgiving, teaching. Ethan felt a strange warmth blooming in his chest. As the kids waved goodbye and headed on their way, Whiskey trotted back to his side and sat again. Ethan ruffled the scruff behind his ears and whispered, "You're teaching me, you know." Whiskey's tail thumped once against the earth. They stood for a long while, watching the creek ripple on, until the sun dipped behind the trees and the wind picked up, bringing the scent of pine and snow. Then they turned and walked home. By late afternoon, the sky over the Montana Valley had taken on the bruised hue of impending fury. Clouds churned like dark tides above the pines, and wind slithered through the trees, moaning low and long. Ethan stood on the porch, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand, watching the storm roll in from the northwest ridge. His cabin, though sturdy, groaned as the pressure dropped. Whiskey had sensed it long before Ethan had. The old dog had been pacing since morning ears twitching, tail low, nails tapping against the floorboards. He sniffed at the air, then sat near the hearth but didn't lie down. Every gust of wind seemed to rattle something loose inside him. Ethan watched him closely. The weather was shifting, and so was the mood. By evening, the storm broke open with the kind of sudden violence only nature could deliver. Thunder cracked like artillery overhead, and lightning stitched across the sky in jagged arcs. Rain fell in sheets, hammering the tin roof of the cabin. Trees bowed and groaned in the wind's wild tantrum. Inside, the lights flickered, then went out. Whiskey bolted. His claws scrabbled across the wooden floor as he dove beneath the heavy oak kitchen table, knocking over a chair in the process. He curled into a tight ball, chest heaving, tail tucked between his legs. A low, pitiful whine escaped his throat. Ethan slowly set his mug down and moved to the table, crouching beside the trembling dog. He didn't speak at first, just breathed slowly, deliberately. His presence was steady. No sudden movements. He knew what fear like this felt like. He had lived inside its jaws. Rain lashed the windows. A particularly loud crash of thunder shook the whole cabin, and Whiskey flinched violently, nearly hitting his head on the table leg. Ethan reached out but stopped just short of touching him. "I'm not leaving you," he whispered, voice low and even. "Not ever." Whiskey's breath hitched, eyes wide with a fear rooted deeper than the present storm. But Ethan held his position grounded, calm, waiting, offering safety, not demanding surrender. Seconds passed. Then, tentatively, Whiskey stretched his front paws out. He edged forward, inch by inch, his nose brushing against Ethan's hand. Finally, with a heavy sigh, he rested his head gently atop Ethan's open palm. Ethan closed his fingers around that warm, scarred head and exhaled. They sat that way for a long time. Storm outside, silence within. The cabin may have been shaking, but in that moment, something far more fragile had stilled. The deep-rooted tremor of distrust, buried in both man and beast. When the worst of the storm had passed, Whiskey finally stood and shook the tension from his coat, then climbed onto the rug beside the cold hearth. Ethan brought out a lantern, its soft yellow glow casting long shadows on the wall. He stoked the fire back to life and sat on the floor beside his companion. Later that night, while Whiskey snored quietly by his feet, Ethan pulled out an old notebook, dusty and leather-bound, and a pen. He stared at the blank page for a long while before he began to write. His handwriting was uneven at first, rusty. "To the guys back at Camp Harper, I know it's been a long time since I reached out. Hell, I didn't think I ever would. But something's changed. I found someone. Not a person, not exactly. A dog. A German shepherd named Whiskey. Someone left him to die, tied up like trash. I took him in. Or maybe he took me in. I'm still broken. That hasn't changed. But for the first time in a long time, I don't feel entirely alone in it. Whiskey doesn't talk, but he listens. He doesn't judge the nights I wake up screaming, and somehow his presence makes the dark feel less like a trap. I think I'm healing. Thought you should know. E." He stared at the words, then folded the page, tucked it into an envelope, and sealed it. It would go out with the next trip into town. It was nothing grand. No declarations, no speeches, just a quiet confession that something was shifting, that maybe, just maybe, healing wasn't a myth reserved for others. That night, the wind died down, the rain softened to a whisper, and for the first time in years, Ethan slept through the night without waking. The morning sun poured through the pine branches like spilled gold, casting soft, shifting patterns on the cabin walls. Spring had crept in quietly over the last week, warming the earth and melting the last snowdrifts clinging to the northern slope. The creek now ran clear and quick, murmuring secrets between stones. Inside the cabin, a familiar stillness hung in the air, but something had changed. Ethan Cole stood by the doorway, his weathered frame upright, dressed in clean jeans and a button-up flannel shirt that still held the scent of firewood. He reached down and scratched gently behind Whiskey's ears. The old dog, now healthier though still thin and stiff at the joints, looked up at him with those clouded yet steady eyes. "Ready?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. Whiskey rose slowly, stretching each limb like an aging soldier shaking off the morning chill. His tail gave a soft thump against the wooden floor. A faded red bandana now hung loosely around his neck. Ethan's small gesture to give him some color, some identity, some pride. Today wasn't just another day. It was the first of something new. They climbed into Ethan's truck, an old green Ford from the early 90s that coughed awake but refused to die, and drove toward the Billings Veterans Outreach Center, an hour east of the mountain town. Along the road, Whiskey sat in the passenger seat, head occasionally out the window, ears flapping, tongue lolling like a banner of defiance against the years behind him. The outreach center was tucked behind a medical clinic, modest in size but rich with stories. The entrance bore a small hand-carved sign that read, "For those who still carry the weight." Ethan had only stepped inside twice before, and both times he'd left within minutes choked by memories, ghosts, and a tightening in his chest he couldn't explain. But today, he wasn't walking in alone. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs platoons frozen in time, dog tags mounted in frames, and patches from every division imaginable. A receptionist, a stout woman in her 50s named Carla with a halo of curly gray hair and quick, kind eyes, looked up and offered a smile. "You must be Ethan," she said, "and this must be Whiskey." "He's the one dragging me here," Ethan muttered, half smiling. Carla came around the desk to kneel and meet Whiskey. "You're going to do some real good here, soldier," she whispered to the dog, running her fingers gently through his coarse fur. They had signed up 2 weeks earlier for the Veterans and Paws Healing Initiative, a program pairing certified therapy dogs with PTSD and trauma survivors in group settings. Ethan wasn't sure if it was for him at first, but it was Whiskey who nudged the idea forward. Quite literally. The old shepherd had once pawed at a flyer that fell off the kitchen table and refused to let Ethan ignore it. Their first group session was held in a modest room with bean bags and mismatched couches. A pot of weak coffee brewed in the corner. There were 6 other veterans seated in a quiet semicircle, men and women in their 20s to 50s, each holding something invisible but heavy. A young man named Trevor sat apart, arms crossed, face blank. He had sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes that darted to the door every few minutes, and a trembling in his knee that wouldn't stop. Whiskey took one look at the room, then padded directly over to Trevor. The young man flinched when the dog sat down beside him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Whiskey did something unexpected. He gently leaned against Trevor's leg and let out a small, reassuring sigh. Trevor's fingers twitched. Then slowly, awkwardly, he reached out and laid a tentative hand on Whiskey's head. He didn't pet him, just held it there. Something raw flashed across his face. "I think," Trevor whispered, barely audible, "I think I can breathe again." Ethan, standing by the wall, swallowed hard. He remembered that first morning by the creek, the rope, the note, the way Whiskey hadn't fought, just waited to be seen. And now, here the dog was, once again showing someone that they weren't alone. After the session, Ethan and Whiskey walked around the back garden of the center. Daffodils had started to bloom near the fence. Ethan reached down and rubbed Whiskey's head again. "You did good, partner," he murmured. Whiskey just yawned, content. That night, back at the cabin, Ethan pulled out his notebook again. "Dear Harper Crew, it's official. Whiskey and I joined the therapy dog program today. I thought I was doing it to help him, but turns out he's helping others. A kid touched him today and said he could breathe again. I don't think Whiskey even knows how powerful he is. I just wanted you all to know. I'm starting to believe in healing. It might not be quick. Might not be loud, but it's real. E." He closed the notebook and set it aside. Outside, the stars came out in slow waves, filling the sky like scattered prayers. The cabin sat in soft silence, warmed by a fire, kept company by a man and his dog, 2 old souls, both once broken, now mended by quiet trust and a new mission. Whiskey shifted in his sleep, one paw twitching, chasing some gentle dream. And Ethan? He smiled in the dark. He was home. Sometimes God doesn't send us miracles wrapped in lightning or glory. Sometimes He sends them quietly on 4 legs, with cloudy eyes, and a heart that still chooses love after being broken. Whiskey wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder that no soul is ever too lost, too old, or too wounded to be redeemed. Through him, Ethan found healing, purpose, and peace. And maybe that's how God works in our lives too, through unexpected second chances, through silent companionship, and through the love we give and receive. If you believe that healing is possible, that no one should suffer alone, and that every act of love is a miracle in itself, please share this story. Comment, Amen. If you believe God places the right souls in our path at the right time. Subscribe for more real stories that restore faith in this world, and may the Lord bless you with comfort, companionship, and peace, just like he did for Ethan and whiskey."
The burned doorstep still smelled of smoke, even though the fire had died days ago. The boards were blackened, the siding warped, and the air carried that heavy silence that only lingers after something terrible. He sat there, unmoving, a German shepherd with scars across his muzzle and flank, his fur a patchwork of ash and gold. Neighbors passed on the sidewalk, giving him a wide berth, their eyes flicking toward him and then away as if looking too long might invite bad luck. No collar, no owner. Just a steady gaze toward the street like he was waiting for someone who would never come. Aiden slowed when he saw him, boots worn from sand and gravel, desert fatigue still creased from a flight home that had not felt like coming home at all. He'd been back less than a week and already avoided crowds, avoided voices. But something about the way the dog refused to move kept his steps coming. He knelt, resting one knee on the cracked concrete. The shepherd didn't flinch, didn't growl, just kept staring ahead. Then, without warning, his ears twitched. His head turned sharply toward a black SUV creeping past, windows tinted too dark for the midday sun. A low growl rolled from deep in his chest. The SUV didn't stop. From across the street, a woman in a shelter uniform called out to Aiden. She said the dog had been brought in twice and both times escaped, returning here. No one wanted him. He was on the list for tomorrow morning. Beck from the HOA had already offered to take care of it. Her tone made it sound like a favor, but the tightness around her eyes betrayed something else. Aiden glanced back at the shepherd, who was watching him now. The dog's eyes weren't wild. They were searching. An elderly neighbor stepped from her porch and shuffled across, a tin in her hands. Mrs. Klein, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's business, pressed the tin into Aiden's palm without a word. Inside was a melted key on a chain and a photograph of a boy with dark hair and one blue sneaker. On the back, written in neat script, was a name: Leo. A sudden tug on his pant leg pulled his focus down. The shepherd had gripped the fabric gently in his teeth and then released, stepping back toward the edge of the yard. Aiden rose, following him through a break in the fence, across a patch of weedy grass, and down toward the dry creek bed. The air smelled faintly of damp earth. The dog dropped to his front paws and began digging, dirt flying in rhythmic bursts. Soon, something cloth-wrapped emerged from the soil. Aiden crouched and brushed away the mud, revealing a charred phone wrapped in a small red hoodie. The hoodie was singed but intact enough to see the size. It belonged to a child. The phone screen was fractured, but when Aiden held the power button, it flickered to life. A single video thumbnail waited on the home screen, its title in lowercase letters: "Don't trust the uniforms." The shepherd sat beside him, his breathing steady but his eyes fixed on that screen, as if he knew exactly what was inside. Aiden's thumb hovered over the play icon. Somewhere behind them, the faint rumble of an engine drew closer. The dog's ears shot up, his head snapping toward the sound. Sunlight flashed off glass in the distance. The moment was brittle, balanced on a knife's edge, and Aiden had the sense that whatever was in that video was not just going to answer questions. It was going to change everything. The video opened with darkness, then a shaky flash of light. A boy's voice called softly, the sound thin and uncertain. The camera shifted, catching the glow of a flashlight from someone standing near the burned townhouse. The figure wore a contractor's vest, the kind issued to private security teams. Behind him, another figure stepped forward, flicking open a lighter. The flame bloomed in the night, and in that instant the camera jolted as a German shepherd lunged into the frame, teeth clamping down on the lighter hand. The image fractured, scattering pixels before cutting to black. Aiden's breath caught. The vest patch was burned into his memory, the same emblem worn by Rourke's team overseas. It wasn't just a company. It was a shadow that had followed him home. His pulse quickened, his mind flashing to a desert night years ago, to the acrid scent of burning oil and a rescue he'd failed to finish. That patch had been there too. The shepherd's gaze stayed locked on him, steady and unblinking. Aiden could feel the weight of that look. This wasn't coincidence. The dog had been there. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Mara emerged from between two houses, her face pale, eyes searching. She froze when she saw the phone in Aiden's hand, then moved closer, her voice low but sharp. She said the boy in the photo, Leo, was her son. He had gone missing the night of the fire. He'd told her he had found a way to erase the bill. Something Beck from the HOA was holding over them. The shepherd stepped forward, placing himself between Mara and Aiden. His stance was protective, body angled toward her, eyes tracking every movement. Aiden could sense the loyalty in that posture, a silent vow to guard her even if it meant standing against everyone else. Mara's voice cracked when she spoke again. She had been searching for weeks, but the police said there was no evidence. She had knocked on every door except this one, the burned threshold where the shepherd kept his vigil. A shadow moved at the far end of the street. Beck, dressed in a pressed polo and wearing that permanent, too pleasant smile, strolled toward them. He called out that the phone was property of the HOA and would need to be surrendered for insurance purposes. His words were smooth, but his eyes never left the shepherd. Aiden said nothing, slipping the phone into his pocket. Beck's smile tightened, his tone dropping lower. He warned about fines, about citations, about making life harder for anyone who stood in the way. Then he turned and walked off, his voice carrying back to them about how this was all being handled. The shepherd's ears twitched again. He was listening to something only he could hear. Somewhere beyond the houses, a faint siren grew louder. Blue lights began to pulse in the distance, reflected in the windows of parked cars. Aiden pulled out the phone, thumbing the screen. Without warning, a small icon appeared at the top, a signal bar and a spinning circle. The phone had begun uploading the video on its own. A progress bar crawled forward, the words, "sending to cloud," flashing briefly before disappearing. The sirens were almost on top of them now. The shepherd stepped closer to Aiden, his eyes locked on the street where headlights were breaking over the rise. Aiden had no idea who would see that video once it finished uploading. But he knew one thing: the moment it hit, the people in that SUV, the ones with those vests, would know too. And they were already here. The sirens faded before they reached the cul-de-sac, replaced by the low rumble of a dark pickup idling at the corner. Its windows were rolled up, engine running steady. Aiden felt the shepherd's muscles go tense beside him, the leash pulling taut toward the sound. He forced himself to turn away, guiding Mara and the dog toward the back streets. They slipped between rows of nearly identical houses until they reached Mrs. Klein's yard. She was waiting on the porch, her hands wrapped around another tin. Without a word, she opened it and spread its contents across the table. Pages from HOA meeting minutes, brittle with age. Most were the usual neighborhood chatter, but a few had single-line entries marked Remediation Fund, with large sums attached and no details. Beside them, clipped in place, were printed bank transfers with Beck's name and a list of fire inspections that had never happened. Mara leaned over the table, her voice shaking. This was leverage. Beck had been manufacturing violations, pushing families to sign relocation agreements. She believed Leo had recorded proof of one of these setups the night he vanished. The shepherd's head suddenly lifted, nose twitching toward the direction of the community pond. Without hesitation, he broke into a run, dragging Aiden along the walkway. The pond's surface shimmered under the midday sun, surrounded by manicured hedges and stone paths. Ghost plunged into the shallow water, splashing hard, disappearing for a moment before surfacing with something clamped in his jaws. A small blue sneaker, water streaming from it. Aiden crouched, taking the sneaker from him. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a metal keycard. The shepherd shook himself dry, spraying water across the path, but his eyes stayed fixed on the sneaker as if it held more than just the card. Aiden pulled out his phone and called an old contact, a buddy from his unit who now worked in private security tech. Over speaker, the voice on the other end whistled low. The keycard wasn't for any ordinary lock. It belonged to a climate-controlled storage facility registered under one of Rourke's shell companies. Mara's hands tightened around the edge of the table. She told them something she hadn't said before. The night after the fire, She'd received an anonymous call from the shelter saying the dog had been dropped off there with no ID. The caller said Leo had sent him to keep the dog safe until the right person found him. They drove across town in silence, the shepherd sitting upright in the back seat, eyes tracking every turn. At the storage facility, the air was cooler, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Aiden slid the keycard into the reader. A green light blinked. The door rolled up, revealing rows of metal shelves stacked with gasoline cans, contractor vests, and boxes of paperwork. The smell of fuel was sharp enough to sting his throat. On the top shelf, a black binder sat apart from the rest. Aiden pulled it down, flipping through pages until he saw a familiar name. It wasn't just Beck and Rourke in the ledger. The third name stopped him cold, his old commanding officer from overseas. The shepherd gave a low, uneasy growl. Somewhere in the storage aisle, a shadow shifted. The sound of boots on concrete echoed faintly, moving closer. The footsteps grew louder, measured, and deliberate. Aiden slid the binder into his pack, keeping his eyes on the far end of the aisle. The shepherd's fur bristled, his body lowering into a stance that was part warning, part readiness. Out of the dim light stepped Rourke, dressed in a pressed jacket, his expression unreadable. He greeted Aiden by name, as if they were meeting for coffee instead of in a storage unit full of arson evidence. His voice carried the weight of memory, each word cutting deep. He spoke about a night in a burned village overseas, about the civilians they hadn't saved. He described the guilt in detail, turning it like a knife. Aiden didn't answer. He didn't need to. Rourke already knew the wound he was pressing on. The shepherd shifted, his ears twitching toward a faint sound coming from outside. It was music, soft and tinny, drifting in through the partially open door. Mrs. Klein's radio had played the same tune earlier. Aiden realized it wasn't random. It was the same lullaby Leo had used to calm the dog. His eyes went to the faint burn marks on the shepherd's jowl. The pattern matched the scorch radius in the ledger's timeline. This wasn't a pet left behind. This was a witness, one who had moved through fire to herd people out. The thought tightened in his chest. This dog had taken the flame so others wouldn't. Rourke's gaze flicked to the dog, then back to Aiden. He said there were people who wanted all this gone, that the easiest path was to hand over the binder and the phone. Aiden asked what happened to Leo. Rourke's pause was calculated, the faintest smile creeping across his face as he replied that the boy was safe, for now. Outside, Mara was waiting with Mrs. Klein near the community clubhouse. They had called for an emergency HOA hearing, forcing Beck into a corner with bylaws that demanded public attendance. Local news crews were already setting up on the lawn, cameras pointed toward the front steps. Aiden walked out of the unit with the shepherd at his side. As they approached the clubhouse, he noticed the dog's head tilt, his eyes lifting toward the high-ceiling vents above the ballroom. A subtle chemical tang reached Aiden's nose, sharp and wrong. He glanced at Mara, then back at the vents. The hum of the air system was louder than usual. The hearing began, Beck seated at the head of the long table, his smile stretched thin. Questions came fast from the few neighbors brave enough to speak, but Beck batted them aside with polished phrases. The shepherd paced, his movements restless, his gaze flicking up again and again to the vents. Aiden's gut tightened. The smell was stronger now, unmistakable, solvent. He caught Mara's eye, giving the smallest shake of his head. And then it happened. A faint click from above, followed by the sudden patter of liquid through the vents. Droplets struck the floor, spreading in dark patches across the polished wood. The shepherd's body stiffened, hackles raised. A small metallic object clattered down the vent shaft, bouncing once before rolling into view. A matchstick, its head already glowing. It skittered across the floor toward the spreading liquid. The air seemed to freeze for a fraction of a second before the room erupted in fire. Flames licked up the walls in a rush, the heat swelling instantly. The shepherd lunged toward the nearest exit, slamming his shoulder into the bar with enough force to jar it open. Smoke rolled low across the floor, curling around chairs and table legs. Aiden grabbed a soaked tablecloth from the refreshments table and swung it wide, smothering a burning patch near the door. Mara was already moving people toward the side hallway, her voice sharp, cutting through the confusion. Mrs. Klein fought her way to the fire alarm, jabbing her cane against the override switch. Water burst from the sprinklers overhead, hammering down on the crowd. The flames hissed but fought back, the accelerant resisting the sudden flood. From the open doorway, Beck's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and angry. He was shouting about cleaning up the dog problem before it ruined everything. The words carried just far enough for a news crew outside to catch them on a live mic. The shepherd darted through the open door, scanning the parking lot. His eyes locked on movement near a row of cars, Rourke, stepping forward with a pistol half raised. Aiden broke into a sprint, colliding with him hard enough to send both of them crashing to the gravel. The weapon skidded under a pickup truck, out of reach. Rourke rolled to his feet faster than Aiden expected, driving a knee into his ribs. The wind left Aiden's chest in a ragged gasp. Rourke's voice was low, dangerous. He said Leo was alive, but only if the dog didn't live to tell the story. The threat was cold, calculated, meant to break resolve. The shepherd didn't hesitate. Instead of going for the gun, he darted toward Aiden's jacket, teeth finding the dangling cord of the phone charger. With a sharp pull, he yanked the phone free from the inside pocket, the screen lighting up. A chime sounded, a single, definitive tone. The upload was complete. Somewhere beyond this parking lot, the video was now public. Rourke froze for half a second, eyes narrowing. Then voices began to rise from the edges of the lot. Neighbors, reporters, people with phones raised. They had seen the chime. They knew something had gone out into the world. The shepherd planted himself between Aiden and Rourke, his body low, his teeth bared. Mara appeared at Aiden's side, pulling him to his feet, her eyes never leaving Rourke. Sirens swelled again, closer this time, the flashing lights washing across the asphalt. The first police unit rolled in fast. Officers stepped out, but instead of moving toward Rourke, they came straight for Aiden. One held up a sheet of paper, reading off an arrest warrant for arson tied to the ledger page from the storage unit. It was forged. Aiden knew it, Rourke knew it, but the cuffs still clicked around his wrists. Mara shouted that they had the truth, that the video was real, that it was already in the hands of everyone watching. But the officers didn't look at her. They moved Aiden toward the cruiser, the shepherd pacing alongside until the door shut. Rourke stood just beyond the flashing lights, the faintest smirk on his face. The message was clear, he still thought he was in control. But the shepherd's steady gaze never left him, and in that silent stare was the promise that control was already slipping away. The back seat of the squad car was hot under the midday sun, the air thick with the smell of vinyl and dust. Aiden stared at the floor, jaw tight, mind racing through every decision that had led to this moment. The door opened and a young officer slid in beside him, not to speak, just to pass his phone across. On the screen was a live stream, footage from the HOA hearing, Beck's voice caught on a hot mic, his threats played over and over. Comments were flooding in. People were posting their own door camera clips, showing Rourke's men planting gasoline cans and tampering with vents. The officer leaned back, speaking quietly enough that only Aiden could hear. His kid had gone to school with Leo. He told Aiden to sit tight and stepped out of the car, leaving the door slightly ajar. Across the street, Mrs. Klein was standing with the local news crew, holding up the binder like a trophy. Neighbors crowded around, their voices growing louder, calling for Beck's removal. Phones were raised in every direction, recording everything. Through the chaos, a sharp bark cut the air. The shepherd was already moving, nose low to the ground, pulling Mara toward the edge of the neighborhood. Aiden's eyes followed until they disappeared behind a row of houses. The young officer reappeared and without a word unlocked the cuffs, nodding once toward the street. Aiden ran. He caught sight of Mara at the storm drain, dropping to her knees to look inside. The shepherd was halfway in, tail wagging low and steady, the faint sound of music drifting up from the darkness. Aiden's chest tightened. It was the same lullaby from the storage unit, tinny and soft. He crouched at the drain's opening, peering into the cool shadows. Leo sat there, knees drawn up, clutching a small toy that played the melody on a loop. His eyes were wide but alive, relief breaking over his face when he saw Mara. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tight, the shepherd lying against them to share his warmth. The officer's voice came from above, calling in the location. Backup arrived quickly, moving in on Rourke's last known position. Across the street, Beck tried to leave in his car, but the crowd stepped into the road, blocking him. The pressure was building, and for once it was aimed in the right direction. Aiden knelt beside the boy and the dog. He rested a hand on the shepherd's back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. In the quiet between sirens and shouts, he spoke the words he had whispered on that first day at the burned doorstep. Never again walk past the bleeding. In the days that followed, charges were filed against Beck and Rourke. The ledger and video became public record. The HOA was dismantled and rebuilt by the residents themselves. Mara signed the adoption papers, and the shepherd was given a new tag. One word was etched into the metal: kept. Aiden visited often, sometimes to train with the dog, sometimes just to sit on the porch while the sun fell across the yard. Ghost, as the neighborhood now called him, had scars that told his story without needing words. There was a calm in his eyes that hadn't been there before, as if the weight he carried had finally been set down. And on quiet afternoons, when the wind moved through the grass and the world felt almost steady, Aiden would catch the dog watching him with that same steady gaze from the first day. Only now it wasn't searching for someone to come. It was certain the right one had already arrived.